The room was supposed to be calm. Just another routine government hearing. But within minutes, the atmosphere inside the chamber shifted. A lawmaker leaned forward, voice sharper than before, and began asking questions that clearly carried an accusation behind them. Cameras started rolling. Reporters began typing faster, and at the center of it all sat Pam Bondi. What happened next turned a standard hearing into one of the most talked about moments of the day because Bondi didn't hesitate. She didn't stay quiet. She pushed back, and suddenly, the hearing got heated. The hearing began like many others. Members of the United States House Judiciary Committee sat behind long wooden desks, arranged in a long row across the front of the chamber. Each lawmaker had stacks of documents, folders, and briefing notes spread neatly in front of them. Some flipped through pages while others quietly reviewed highlighted sections of reports prepared by their staff. The room itself carried the formal atmosphere that often surrounds government proceedings. Bright overhead lights illuminated the chamber, while cameras from several media outlets stood positioned along the walls. Microphones rested on the desks, waiting to capture every word spoken during the hearing. Staff members moved quietly through the room, occasionally leaning toward lawmakers to whisper reminders or pass small slips of paper with notes and talking points. The sound of rustling documents mixed with the faint tapping of laptop keyboards from the press section in the back rows. Reporters had already taken their seats. Many of them had covered hearings like this dozens of times before. They knew that most hearings follow a predictable pattern: prepared statements, careful questioning, and long stretches where very little drama unfolds. Still, experienced journalists also knew something else. Every now and then, a hearing could suddenly become the center of national attention. That possibility kept them alert. Some reporters adjusted their recording devices while others typed quick updates to editors, preparing for the possibility that something noteworthy might happen. At the center of the room sat the witness table, and seated there was Pam Bondi. Bondi sat upright, a folder of documents placed neatly in front of her. A glass of water rested beside the microphone positioned near her seat. From the outside, she appeared calm and composed, carefully observing the room as lawmakers prepared to begin the questioning. For Bondi, this type of setting was familiar territory. Years earlier, she had served as the Attorney General of Florida, a role that often required her to defend complex legal decisions under intense public scrutiny. During her time in that position, she had spent countless hours inside courtrooms, legislative chambers, and press briefings. Tough questions from judges, attorneys, journalists, and lawmakers had become a routine part of her professional life. Because of that experience, Bondi appeared comfortable in the environment. She sat patiently as opening remarks were delivered by committee members. Occasionally she nodded while listening, but for the most part she remained still, focused on the discussion taking place around her. When the questioning portion of the hearing finally began, the early exchanges were measured and respectful. One lawmaker asked about previous legal decisions connected to her time in public office. Another asked for clarification about certain policies and how they had been implemented. Each question was delivered in a calm tone. And Bondi responded in much the same way. She spoke slowly and clearly, choosing her words carefully. Rather than rushing through answers, she often paused briefly, making sure her responses were precise and consistent with the official record. Observers in the room could tell she was experienced at handling this type of situation. There were no emotional reactions. No defensive gestures. Just careful explanations. At times, she referred to documents in front of her, occasionally glancing down to verify details before continuing her answer. When she finished speaking, she would look back toward the lawmakers seated at the committee desk, waiting for the next question. For the first portion of the hearing, everything followed a predictable rhythm. A lawmaker would ask a question. Bondi would respond. Then another lawmaker would take their turn. The process repeated again and again, creating the steady pace that most government hearings follow. In the press section, reporters typed short notes summarizing the answers being given. Some whispered quietly to colleagues sitting beside them, comparing observations about the discussion. Nothing about the hearing seemed unusual. In fact, it looked very much like hundreds of other hearings that had taken place in the same room over the years. But experienced observers know that sometimes the most dramatic moments begin during the calmest parts of a hearing. Often, it only takes a single question to shift the atmosphere. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the tone in the room began to change. One lawmaker leaned forward slightly in their chair while reviewing a document. In front of them, another staff member hurried toward the committee desk and handed over a fresh note. In the press section, a few reporters noticed the shift and lifted their eyes from their laptops. Something about the body language in the room had changed. The calm rhythm that had guided the hearing so far was beginning to fade. No one had raised their voice yet. No one had made a dramatic statement. But the direction of the conversation was starting to move somewhere new, and as the next round of questioning began, it became clear that the hearing was about to take a very different turn. About halfway through the hearing, one lawmaker took the floor and began a new line of questioning directed at Pam Bondi. Up to that point, the hearing had followed a fairly predictable pattern. Members of the committee asked questions, Bondi responded, and the discussion moved steadily from one topic to the next. It was serious, but orderly. Staff members quietly passed documents across the desks, and the audience in the back of the room listened attentively. But the moment this particular lawmaker began speaking, the atmosphere changed. The shift in tone was immediate. Instead of asking a straightforward question, the lawmaker began by laying out a series of detailed statements. One after another, they referenced decisions made during Bondi's time in public office. Each point was delivered carefully, almost like building the steps of an argument. The structure of the remarks was deliberate. First came a description of a past decision, then came a suggestion that the circumstances surrounding that decision had raised concerns at the time, and finally came the implication that the decision deserved closer scrutiny now. It wasn't a single accusation stated outright, it was something more subtle, a narrative being built, piece by piece. As the lawmaker continued speaking, the implication behind the statements began to hang in the air. The way the comments were framed suggested that decisions made during Bondi's tenure might not have been as straightforward as they once appeared. People in the room noticed it. Immediately, the quiet rhythm that had defined much of the hearing suddenly gave way to a sense of tension. Reporters who had been typing casually began leaning closer to their laptops. Some paused to look up from their screens. Watching the exchange unfold in real time, camera operators adjusted their angles slightly, sensing that the moment might turn into something more significant. Even the other lawmakers seated behind the long desks seemed to shift their attention. Moments like this are exactly what make congressional hearings unpredictable. On the surface, hearings are structured events. They follow formal procedures, time limits, and strict rules about how questions are asked and answered, but beneath that structure lies something else. A political dynamic where different perspectives collide. Lawmakers try to extract information. Witnesses try to explain or defend decisions, and sometimes those interactions evolve into direct confrontations. This felt like one of those moments. The lawmaker continued, outlining the series of statements, occasionally pausing to glance down at their notes before continuing. Each remark seemed to tighten the focus on Bondi's past actions. The longer the statement went on, the clearer it became that the question at the end would not be a simple one. At the witness table, Bondi remained composed. She sat upright, her hands resting calmly on the table in front of her, as the lawmaker spoke. She listened carefully. She didn't interrupt. She didn't attempt to jump in to correct the statements being made. Instead, she allowed the lawmaker to finish completely. That choice alone drew quiet attention in the room. In political hearings, witnesses sometimes try to push back immediately when they hear something they disagree with. Interruptions are not uncommon when tensions rise. But Bondi did the opposite. She waited. Observers, watching closely, could see that she was following every detail of the remarks. Occasionally, she nodded slightly, acknowledging that she had heard the point being made, but otherwise, she remained still. The lawmaker eventually reached the end of the long setup and leaned slightly toward the microphone. Then came the question. It was framed in a way that brought together all the earlier statements, asking Bondi to explain why those decisions had been made and whether, in hindsight, they had been appropriate. For a brief moment, the room grew noticeably quieter. This was the moment everyone had been anticipating. The build-up had been long enough that the response now carried weight. Reporters paused there, typing. A few people in the audience leaned forward in their seats. At the witness table, Bondi took a moment before responding. She didn't rush to speak. Instead, she adjusted the microphone slightly and glanced down at her notes. When she finally looked back up toward the committee, her expression remained calm and controlled, but her posture suggested something important. She wasn't going to let the accusation go unanswered, rather than simply giving a brief reply. Bondi began addressing the premise of the question itself. Her response made it clear that she believed that characterization of those past decisions was incomplete. She started outlining the context surrounding the events being discussed, explaining the legal responsibilities her office had at the time, and the information available when those decisions were made. Her tone remained steady throughout. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't appear defensive, but the message behind her words was unmistakable. If the lawmaker intended to frame the situation in a particular way, Bondi intended to challenge that framing point by point. And as she continued speaking, it became clear that this exchange was quickly becoming one of the defining moments of the entire hearing. When Pam Bondi began speaking, the atmosphere inside the hearing room shifted almost instantly. Just moments earlier, the exchange had followed the familiar rhythm of many congressional hearings. Lawmakers asked questions, witnesses responded, staff members passed notes back and forth while reporters quietly typed on their laptops. But this moment felt different. Instead of offering a brief, carefully measured response, Bondi took a moment before answering. She looked directly at the lawmaker who had raised the question and began explaining why she believed the issue had been presented in a way that left out important context. Her tone was calm and controlled, but the message behind her words was unmistakably firm. Bondi explained that the description of her actions, as presented in the question, did not fully capture the circumstances surrounding the decisions being discussed. According to her, the situation at the time involved a number of legal considerations and responsibilities that could not be reduced to a simple headline or accusation. She reminded the committee that when she served as Florida's Attorney General, her office was responsible for making decisions based on the information available at that moment, information that was sometimes incomplete, evolving, or subject to interpretation. Those decisions, she said, were made carefully and with the guidance of legal advisors and investigators. Bondi acknowledged that years later, it can be easy to look back and question why certain choices were made, but she emphasized that public officials often operate under intense pressure and tight time. They must weigh legal obligations, evidence, and public interest all at once. And those decisions rarely appear as simple in real time as they might seem when discussed in hindsight. As she spoke, several people in the room leaned forward. The tone of the hearing had clearly shifted. What had begun as a routine line of questioning was now turning into something more intense, a direct debate about how past decisions should be interpreted. The lawmaker who had raised the issue listened closely but did not appear satisfied with Bondi's explanation. After she finished speaking, the lawmaker pushed back. They repeated the central concern behind the original question and suggested that the decisions made during Bondi's time in office may have raised legitimate questions about oversight and accountability. The implication behind the comment was clear. They believed the issue deserved a more direct acknowledgement. Bondi did not interrupt. She waited until the lawmaker finished speaking before responding again. This time, her answer included more detail. She began outlining the circumstances surrounding the decisions in question, explaining what information had been available at the time and how her office had evaluated it. She described the legal standards that guided the process and the steps her team took before reaching a final conclusion. The explanation was methodical and precise. For observers in the room, the exchange began to feel less like a standard committee hearing and more like a courtroom argument. Each side was carefully presenting its position. The lawmaker emphasized concerns about accountability and transparency. Bondi focused on the legal framework and the context behind the actions being discussed. At several points during the exchange, the tension in the room became noticeable. Reporters paused their typing to listen more closely. Camera operators adjusted their angles. Moments like this are often what draw the most attention during hearings, not because voices are raised, but because two perspectives collide so clearly in front of a national audience. Despite the sharper tone of the conversation, Bondi maintained her composure throughout. She spoke steadily and avoided reacting emotionally to the criticism. Instead, she returned repeatedly to the same central argument, that decisions made in government, particularly in legal offices, involve complex judgments that cannot always be understood without examining the full context. The lawmaker, however, continued pressing. Their questions reflected a broader concern shared by some critics that the public deserves clear explanations for controversial decisions made by those in positions of authority. For several minutes, the exchange moved back and forth in this way. Question, response, follow, up, clarification. Neither side appeared willing to step away from the issue. Both were defending their positions with careful language and measured arguments. For viewers watching the hearing unfold, it was a moment that captured something important about these kinds of proceedings. Congressional hearings are not simply about gathering information. They are also arenas where competing interpretations of events are tested in public. Lawmakers ask tough questions to challenge witnesses. Witnesses defend their actions and explain their reasoning. And occasionally, those exchanges become moments that reveal just how strongly people feel about the issues being discussed. By the time this particular exchange slowed down, it had become one of the most talked about moments of the hearing. Not because it turned into a shouting match, but because it showed two sides standing firmly behind their perspectives. Bondi had made it clear she believed the narrative being presented was incomplete. The lawmaker had made it equally clear that the questions surrounding those decisions were not going away. And in that moment, neither side seemed ready to back down. Even people sitting quietly in the back rows could sense that something unusual was happening at first. The hearing had followed the familiar rhythm that most government proceedings do. Lawmakers asked questions. Witnesses responded. Staff members quietly passed notes back and forth. But gradually, the atmosphere inside the room began to change. Reporters sitting along the walls noticed it first. Their fingers started moving faster across their keyboards as they typed, trying to capture every line of the exchange before the next question arrived. Some leaned closer to their laptops, occasionally glancing up at the witness table to make sure they didn't miss a single moment. Camera operators adjusted their angles, carefully repositioning their equipment to focus on the center of the room where the questioning was taking place. They had covered countless hearings before, but moments like this, when tension slowly built between a lawmaker and a witness, were exactly the kind of moments that could quickly become the headline of the day. At the center of it all sat Pam Bondi. Despite the rising intensity of the questioning, Bondi remained composed. Her posture stayed steady, her hands resting calmly on the table in front of her. Anyone watching closely could see that she was choosing her words carefully before responding to each new question. Even as the lawmaker's tone became more pointed, Bondi continued, answering in a measured and controlled manner. There were no raised voices, no visible frustration. Instead, she spoke with the calm confidence of someone who had spent years navigating hyper-sure legal environments. At one point during the exchange, Bondi paused briefly before responding to a particularly direct question. She leaned slightly toward the microphone and made a broader point about the nature of hearings like this one. Disagreements between lawmakers and public officials, she explained, were not unusual. In fact, they were part of the system itself. Hearings exist precisely so those disagreements can be discussed openly, questioned thoroughly, and examined in front of the public. They are designed to test arguments, challenge decisions, and allow both sides to present their perspectives. Bondi emphasized that this process, while sometimes tense, is a key part of democratic oversight. The room remained quiet as she spoke. For a moment, it seemed like the tension might ease. But the lawmaker questioning her was not ready to move on. Instead, the questions continued, one followed another in quick succession, each one probing deeper into the decisions that had brought Bondi before the committee in the first place. The lawmaker appeared determined to push past general explanations and reach something more specific. Bondi listened carefully to each question before responding. She didn't interrupt, she didn't rush, and she didn't attempt to deflect the questions entirely. Instead, she addressed them directly, explaining the reasoning behind the actions being discussed and outlining the responsibilities her office had carried at the time. For several minutes, the exchange went back and forth. From the outside, it almost resembled a courtroom cross-examination rather than a routine committee hearing. Each question was structured to challenge a previous statement. Each answer attempted to clarify the context surrounding the decision being debated. Observers in the room could feel the growing tension. Some staff members exchanged glances. A few reporters briefly stopped typing, looking up from their screens as the conversation intensified. Moments like this often become the defining point of a hearing, not because of dramatic outbursts, but because they reveal how firmly each side holds to its position. And that was exactly what was happening here. With every response Bondi gave, it became clearer that she was not going to retreat from her position. She continued explaining the context behind the decisions under discussion, emphasizing that they had been made based on the information available at the time and within the legal framework her office was required to follow. To her, the issue wasn't simply about defending a single action, it was about defending the process that led to it. The lawmaker, however, remained focused on pressing for further clarity. Their questions grew more detailed, sometimes revisiting points that had already been raised earlier in the hearing. But Bondi's approach did not change. She maintained the same steady tone, the same deliberate pacing, and the same clear insistence that her decisions had been made with careful consideration of both the law and the responsibilities of her office. What stood out most to those watching wasn't just the tension. Between the two sides, it was the contrast in styles. The lawmaker pressed forward, attempting to expose inconsistencies or weaknesses in the explanation being offered. Bondi, on the other hand, appeared determined to remain calm and methodical, focusing on providing answers rather than reacting emotionally to the intensity of the questioning. As the exchange continued, it became one of the most talked about moments of the hearing. Not because it was loud or chaotic, but because it illustrated something that hearings often reveal: the collision of two different interpretations of the same set of events, one side seeking accountability, the other defending the reasoning behind its decisions. And through it all, Bondi showed no sign of backing away. Even as the questions continued, her message remained consistent. She was prepared to explain her actions, prepared to defend her decisions, and prepared to stand by the position she had taken, even under the bright lights of a public hearing and the relentless scrutiny that came with it. As the hearing slowly moved toward its final moments, the atmosphere inside the room began to change. The sharp tension that had filled the chamber earlier in the day started to ease. Lawmakers shuffled their papers, staff members leaned in to exchange quiet comments, and the rhythm of the questioning returned to a more measured pace. One by one, members of the committee took their turns asking final questions. Some focused on clarifying earlier points. Others used their time to highlight issues they believed still deserved attention. Compared to the heated exchange that had taken place earlier, these moments felt calmer, almost routine. But even as the tone softened, it was clear that the earlier confrontation had already become the defining moment of the hearing. Reporters sitting in the back of the room had captured every second. Clips of the exchange were already beginning to circulate online. Within political circles, conversations were shifting away from the technical details of the hearing and toward the moment when the tension had reached its peak. For many observers watching the proceedings both in the room and through live broadcasts, exchange revealed something important about how government hearings can unfold. On the surface, hearings are structured events. They follow strict procedures. Lawmakers ask questions. Witnesses respond. Time limits are enforced. The entire process is designed to maintain order and keep discussions focused. But underneath that structure, hearings can also become stages for powerful disagreements. When strong opinions collide, the calm and formal setting can quickly give way to moments of intense debate. That's exactly what had happened earlier in the day. What began as a standard line of questioning gradually turned into a sharper exchange, as the lawmakers' tone grew more critical and the implications behind the questions became more direct. For a brief moment, the hearing room felt less like a routine government proceeding and more like the center of a political storm. Yet throughout that moment, one thing stood out to many people watching: Pam Bondi's reaction. Rather than becoming visibly frustrated or defensive, she remained composed. Her responses were steady and deliberate. Instead of avoiding the criticism, she addressed it directly. She explained the reasoning behind the decisions being discussed and pushed back against what she believed were incomplete or misleading characterizations. For supporters, that approach reinforced the reputation she had built during her years in public office. During her time as Florida's Attorney General, Bondi had often found herself in high-profile debates on legal and political issues. Those moments frequently placed her in the center of national attention. Over time, a consistent pattern emerged. When faced with criticism or tough questioning, she rarely chose to step away from the argument. Instead, she engaged with it. Whether appearing in courtrooms, press conferences, or legislative hearings, Bondi typically responded by explaining her position in clear and direct terms. That same approach was visible again inside the hearing room. Even as the questions grew sharper earlier in the day, she continued answering carefully and methodically. Observers noticed that she didn't interrupt the lawmaker speaking to her. She waited for each question to finish before responding. But when she did respond, she made it clear that she disagreed with the premise behind some of the criticism. To some viewers, that moment represented determination. To others, it represented a clash between two very different interpretations of the same events. Either way, it was the kind of exchange that reminds people why hearings like this often capture public attention. They are not just about gathering information. They are also about accountability, perspective, and the clash of competing viewpoints. By the time the hearing moved into its closing phase, the earlier tension had largely faded. The remaining questions were shorter. The responses became more procedural, and eventually, the chair signaled that the session was nearing its end. Chairs shifted. Microphones were turned off. Papers were stacked neatly together. What had started hours earlier as a highly structured government proceeding was finally wrapping up. In the room itself, the conclusion felt quiet. There was no dramatic final statement, No sudden burst of conflict, just the slow, orderly end of a long day of testimony and discussion. But outside the hearing room, the earlier exchange continued to echo. Political commentators began discussing it almost immediately. News outlets highlighted the moment as a key point from the hearing. Online audiences replayed the exchange again and again, analyzing every word and reaction. Moments like this often become the lasting memory of a hearing. Not the hours of routine discussion, not the procedural votes or technical clarifications, but the brief period when tension rises and two sides openly challenge each other's perspectives. For Pam Bondi, the moment reinforced something that many people had said about her. Throughout her career, she was not someone who easily stepped back when confronted with criticism. Whether in legal battles, political debates, or public hearings, she tended to meet those challenges head-on. Supporters saw that as confidence. Critics sometimes saw it as stubbornness, but regardless of how people interpreted it, the pattern remained consistent. And on that day, inside the hearing room, that reputation was once again on full display. By the time the session officially adjourned, the room had returned to calm. Lawmakers stood and spoke briefly with staff members. Reporters packed up their equipment. The crowd slowly filtered out through the tall doors of the chamber. The hearing itself had ended quietly, yet the moment of confrontation that unfolded earlier served as a reminder of something deeper about the nature of government proceedings behind the formal rules, the polished speeches, and the structured format. Real debates are always taking place. Strong opinions collide. Different interpretations of events compete for attention, and sometimes those tensions briefly rise to the surface for everyone to see. That day's hearing was no exception. The proceedings may have ended with little fanfare, but the exchange that unfolded in the middle of it remained a powerful reminder that in the world of politics and law, even the most orderly settings can suddenly become arenas for intense debate. If you found this story interesting, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more powerful courtroom moments and political hearing breakdowns. Also, share this video with friends who enjoy behind-the-scenes insights into major legal and political events. And don't forget to drop a comment below which moment surprised you the most. Your support helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming. Thanks for watching.